August 25th, 1944. Northern France. The air trembles with the sound of engines, thousands of them. A line of olive-drab trucks stretches across the horizon, snaking through the dust-choked roads from Normandy to Chartres. Each truck bears the white star of the United States Army, each loaded to its brim with fuel, food, and ammunition. Soldiers, exhausted and drenched in sweat, grip their steering wheels, their faces ghostly under the film of dust that clings to their skin. They call it the Red Ball Express, a lifeline born out of desperation and ambition. From sunrise to sundown, convoys thunder eastward without pause. They pass the smoldering wrecks of villages, overturned German wagons, and the silent faces of liberated civilians. From afar, German officers watch through binoculars, stunned by what they see. Not tanks, not bombers, but endless supplies. A river of steel and gasoline feeding an advancing army that refuses to slow down. This was the day Germany realized the truth. America's greatest weapon wasn't just its soldiers. It was its ability to move them, feed them, and fuel them faster than anyone in history. Long before that endless convoy rolled across France, the war had already revealed its harshest truth. Victory would belong not only to those who could fight, but to those who could sustain the fight. By 1940, the German blitzkrieg had stunned the world. Swift, precise, and seemingly unstoppable, their armored divisions tore through Europe with terrifying speed. They conquered with lightning-fast tanks, coordinated air power, and calculated risk. But behind that brilliance was a quiet weakness, a supply chain stretched thin and fragile. The Wehrmacht's trucks often broke down, fuel convoys lagged behind, and by the time they reached deep into Russia, German soldiers were marching more than their engines were running. The United States, still watching from across the Atlantic, learned from this. America's military planners saw that logistics, the art of keeping an army fed, fueled, and armed, would be the true measure of modern warfare. By the time America entered the war in December 1941, it was already transforming into an industrial powerhouse unmatched in scale. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago roared day and night. Assembly lines built tanks, planes, and trucks faster than the Axis could destroy them. By 1943, the United States was producing nearly half the world's total war materials, an output that would soon make Allied logistics something no enemy could comprehend. When the Allies began planning Operation Overland, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, every general knew the landing itself was only the beginning. The greater challenge lay beyond the beaches, sustaining millions of men once they broke free from Normandy's narrow lanes. Each division required over 700 tons of supplies every single day: fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts. Multiply that by dozens of divisions, and you have a logistical burden beyond any precedent in human history. In early August 1944, as the Allied breakout from Normandy turned into a full-scale pursuit across France, their own success created a new crisis. The tanks of Patton's Third Army were outrunning their fuel trucks. The front lines were advancing up to 80 miles per day, while the supply depots still sat near the beaches of Normandy. Roads were clogged, bridges destroyed, and railways shattered by months of bombing. Without fuel, even the most powerful tank was nothing more than a steel coffin. Eisenhower knew it, Bradley knew it, and so did every soldier waiting on the road. The war machine that had landed with overwhelming strength now faced the same peril that had doomed Germany and Russia: the tyranny of distance. The Allied armies stood on the edge of opportunity, but they could only seize it if their supply lines could keep up. What came next would be one of the greatest improvisations in military history, a feat of organization, endurance, and sheer willpower that would redefine how wars were fought forever. Because somewhere in the chaos of that August, a new idea was born. A highway of trucks running day and night, dedicated solely to feeding the front. A bold name was given to it: the Red Ball Express. and it would become the heartbeat of victory in Europe. The idea emerged not from luxury, but from desperation. By mid-August 1944, the Allied advance had moved so quickly that traditional supply routes were collapsing under their own success. Patton's Third Army had pierced the German lines, sweeping through Brittany and pushing toward the Seine. But every mile gained on the map strained the fuel reserves that made such movement possible. In the fields of Normandy, trucks sat idle, their tanks dry. Mechanics scavenged for spare parts from wrecks. Fuel drums were rolled by hand when engines failed. Commanders began rationing gasoline by the gallon, deciding which divisions could move and which would have to wait. To Eisenhower, it was unacceptable. The Allies had not fought their way across the beaches only to stall for want of fuel. On August 25, 1944, the same day Paris was liberated, an order was issued. A special, non-stop convoy system would be established to rush critical supplies to the front. Its route, from the port of Saint-Lô to the forward depots near Chartres and Verdun, would run like a bloodstream through liberated France. It was called the Red Ball Express, named after the red circular markers used in U.S. railroads to signify priority freight. The meaning was clear. Nothing stopped these trucks. More than 6,000 vehicles were mobilized almost overnight, most of them GMC 2.5-ton trucks, the iconic Deuce and a Half. The convoys would run 24 hours a day, with trucks moving in two continuous columns, one northbound loaded with fuel and ammunition, the other southbound returning empty for resupply. Military police cleared civilian traffic from the route. Bridges and crossroads were marked with red signs bearing a single white arrow, pointing the way to the front. What made the Red Ball Express extraordinary wasn't just its speed or scale. It was the people who made it run. Nearly 75% of the drivers were African-American soldiers, members of segregated transportation battalions who were rarely acknowledged in official reports. They drove for up to 16 hours at a stretch through bombed-out towns, cratered roads, and sudden ambushes from German stragglers. Many had never driven trucks before the war, but within weeks they became the nerve fibers of the Allied advance. Every day, the convoys carried up to 12,500 tons of supplies, gasoline, food, ammunition, spare parts, enough to sustain multiple armies in constant motion. The trucks moved so relentlessly that dust clouds from their passage were visible for miles. They slept in their cabs, ate cold rations, and fixed engines by flashlight when transmissions burned out. Meanwhile, German high command was baffled. Their own fuel depots were dwindling, their railways were shattered by Allied bombers, and their armies were trapped in retreat. Yet somehow the Americans kept coming, faster, heavier, more mechanized than anyone thought possible. To the Wehrmacht officers who once prided themselves on precision logistics, the American supply convoys looked like chaos, until they realized that chaos was the system. Trucks departed whenever ready. Routes were improvised. Repairs happened in the mud. But it worked. Behind every tank at the front stood a chain of men and machines stretching hundreds of miles. The Americans didn't just build a road, they built a pulse. But as the Red Ball Express thundered eastward, cracks began to appear. Engines overheated, tires exploded, mechanics were overwhelmed. And as the Allies advanced deeper into France, the distance between ports and the front doubled, then tripled. Even the most efficient convoys couldn't outrun physics. By September, new challenges loomed. Bridges collapsed under weight, roads turned to rivers of mud, and fuel shortages threatened again. Yet the convoys pressed on, sometimes escorted by armored cars to deter ambushes, sometimes guided only by moonlight and instinct. Every drum of gasoline delivered meant another Sherman tank that could move, another artillery gun that could fire. In the brutal arithmetic of war, logistics had become the deciding equation. What began as a desperate improvisation was now the lifeline of the Allied advance, a miracle born of necessity, courage, and endurance. And it was only the beginning of the story. Because the Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply route. It was a lesson in what happens when speed meets resolve, and when an army learns to turn its logistics into a weapon. The drivers who carried the war on their backs. They called themselves the Red Ballers, men who spent their war not behind rifles, but behind steering wheels. Each morning, if one could call it that, since many had not slept, the drivers climbed into their trucks, engines coughing to life in the cold dawn. The roar of thousands of motors became their battle hymn. These were not the glamorous heroes of propaganda posters. They were truck drivers, grease-stained and sleep-deprived, facing the same dangers as those in combat. Most of them were African-American soldiers, members of segregated units that the Army, at first, had deemed unfit for combat. But on the Red Ball, they became indispensable. Units like the 514th and 3918th Quartermaster truck companies carried more than supplies. They carried the very rhythm of the Allied advance. They drove day and night, often with blackout lights to avoid Luftwaffe strafing. German snipers hid in the forests. Some convoys vanished under sudden artillery fire. Accidents were constant. Brakes failed, axles snapped, and fatigue took its toll. Drivers tied strings to their wrists connected to the steering wheel, a desperate trick to keep themselves awake. Each trip was a gamble. But still they drove, pushing the convoys forward mile after mile. If the trucks stop, the war stops, one soldier recalled. And they knew it was true. Despite segregation, camaraderie ran deep. Drivers helped one another through breakdowns, swapped spare parts, and shared cigarettes along the roadside. For many, it was their first time being treated as equals by white officers, not out of charity, but out of necessity. On the Red Ball, rank and race blurred beneath the dust. Everyone had one mission: keep the front alive. Their story was rarely told after the war. Yet, without them, Patton's tanks would have sat silent in the fields of France. The Red Ball Express was a human machine powered by determination and by thousands of men who proved that courage isn't confined to the battlefield. The beating heart of the Red Ball Express was a machine so reliable it became legendary. The GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't carry guns or armor, but it carried the war. Powered by a 6-cylinder engine capable of hauling nearly 3 tons over mud, rubble, or shattered asphalt, the GMC truck was the unsung hero of the Allied logistics revolution. Tens of thousands rolled off American assembly lines, each almost identical. Simple to repair, easy to drive, and rugged enough to survive months of abuse. Mechanics could strip and rebuild an engine on the roadside using nothing but hand tools and spare parts from another wrecked truck. Fuel was loaded in 5-gallon jerry cans, stacked like bricks. Ammunition crates were packed floor to ceiling. Every inch of space mattered. Drivers learned to balance loads by instinct, because an unbalanced truck could tip over on a narrow bridge and block the convoy for hours. Convoys were timed like clockwork. Trucks departed in intervals of 50 yards, each following the dust cloud of the one ahead. There was no GPS, no radios in most vehicles, only maps, painted signs, and the intuition of men who learned the roads by memory. Breakdowns were expected. Each convoy had maintenance trucks following behind, carrying spare tires, water pumps, and oil. Soldiers became mechanics overnight. They could replace a clutch in darkness, guided only by flashlights covered in blue cloth to hide from enemy aircraft. In a single day, the Red Ball Express consumed over 300,000 gallons of fuel, just to deliver more fuel. The paradox was immense. An army of trucks burning gasoline to keep tanks and planes moving. But it worked because the scale of American production made such waste possible. The Germans had precision. The Americans had abundance. And when abundance was organized into motion, it became unstoppable. The Red Ball Express didn't just move supplies. It reshaped the tempo of war itself.
Before 1944, warfare was dictated by how fast an army could bring its guns and food to the front. A rapid advance often meant a sudden pause, time to refill fuel, replace losses, and realign transport. But the Red Ball changed that equation. It turned mobility into an unbroken stream. General Patton understood it best. His armored columns lived on momentum: attack, exploit, pursue. He famously said, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." He knew that if the truck stopped, his advance would die. Thanks to the Red Ball, his Third Army raced across France at a speed that stunned both allies and enemies. The convoys ensured his tanks never stayed idle for long. Every night, fresh supplies arrived. Every morning, the front moved east. But speed had a cost. Roads jammed with hundreds of vehicles, accidents caused chain delays that rippled for miles. Military police worked tirelessly to direct traffic, while engineers reinforced bridges to prevent collapse under endless tonnage. The Germans retreating through France were caught in a nightmare they could not comprehend. Their supply system depended on railroads, bombed daily by Allied planes. Their fuel was gone, their convoys decimated. Meanwhile, the Americans built new roads faster than the Germans could destroy them. It was the first modern demonstration of what military strategists would later call logistical supremacy. For the first time in history, logistics wasn't supporting the war, it was the war. Every shell fired, every tank that rolled forward, every plane that took off from a captured airfield, all depended on that relentless highway of trucks grinding eastward through France.
For the German High Command, the sight of endless American convoys rolling across France defied logic. Their understanding of warfare was rooted in precision and control, every movement calculated, every division supplied by rail, every liter of fuel accounted for. The German army had long believed that efficiency came from discipline and order, not scale. But as the summer of 1944 unfolded, that belief began to crumble. From observation posts in the hills of Champagne and Lorraine, German officers watched with disbelief as the Allied supply network pulsed across the countryside. Every road seemed alive, trucks in columns, headlights glimmering like fireflies in the dusk, military police directing traffic like an orchestra. Captured German diaries revealed the shock. One officer wrote, "They have no railways, yet they move like a flood. It is as if the earth itself delivers their fuel." For a Wehrmacht already strangled by shortages, the comparison was humiliating. Their own fuel reserves were nearly gone, their refineries bombed into ruin. The mighty panzers that once terrorized Europe now sat abandoned for lack of gasoline. Soldiers siphoned fuel from wrecked vehicles just to move artillery pieces. In contrast, the Americans seemed to possess infinite reserves. Where a German battalion might receive a few dozen gallons a day, an Allied armored division consumed 100,000 gallons daily and received it without fail. The Germans had mocked American excess before, sneering that the Allies fought with machines, not men. But now they saw that those machines were the very reason the war was turning against them. Every truck that roared through France carried not just fuel, it carried inevitability. By the time the Red Ball Express reached full capacity in September 1944, it had become clear the Allied advance wasn't limited by courage or firepower, but only by how fast their trucks could drive. The Germans had underestimated not just America's industry, but its ability to deliver it to the battlefield. Eisenhower, Bradley, and the art of feeding an army. At the top of the Allied chain of command, the struggle for supplies wasn't a distant logistical matter. It was a daily war of decisions, what historians would later call the logistics battle. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, carried the burden of balance. His armies stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the Belgian frontier. Every general demanded more fuel, more ammunition, more transport. Eisenhower had to decide who would move and who would wait. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group and George S. Patton's Third Army were advancing faster than supply lines could keep up with. Meanwhile, Bernard Montgomery in the north argued that his forces deserved priority for a single decisive thrust into Germany. The arguments reached peak fever in early September. Eisenhower held firm. He believed in a broad front strategy, feeding all armies equally, ensuring no single front collapsed from neglect. The Red Ball Express became the instrument of that philosophy. It didn't favor any one commander, it sustained the entire front. But Patton, ever impatient, pushed the limits. He ordered his tanks to press forward even when fuel was dangerously low, confident the convoys would deliver. His staff coordinated directly with the Red Ball Command, demanding faster turnaround, better routes, and sometimes commandeering fuel trucks from other sectors. The strain on logistics officers was immense. Colonel Lauren Albert Ayres, overseeing much of the supply effort, later admitted, "It was organized chaos. We were creating an army that moved faster than our maps could track." Yet Eisenhower's gamble paid off. The Red Ball Express didn't just supply, it symbolized Allied adaptability. It showed that logistics could be molded, accelerated, and weaponized under pressure. For every battle fought with bullets, there was another fought behind the lines, with fuel gauges, spared tires, and schedules scribbled on notepads. The generals might have worn stars, but the outcome depended on the men behind the wheel. The silent power behind victory. In the grand histories of World War II, names like Normandy, Bastogne, and Berlin dominate the pages. Yet the Red Ball Express seldom shares the spotlight. Its soldiers were anonymous, its triumphs invisible. But the moral weight of its story is immense, because for every celebrated victory, there must first be someone willing to build the road to it. The Red Ball Express was more than a supply line. It was a symbol of what industrial democracy could achieve under fire. In an army still divided by segregation, black soldiers carried the logistical burden that made Allied liberation possible. They worked without fanfare, often without recognition, yet their labor kept entire armies alive. It was also a triumph of cooperation. Engineers, drivers, mechanics, and planners, thousands of individuals from different ranks and nationalities, synchronized in motion. The British provided ports, the Americans provided manpower, the French repair roads, and local civilians guided convoys through unfamiliar terrain. Strategically, it marked a turning point in military thought. For centuries, logistics had been the quiet servant of war. The Red Ball Express proved it was the master. From that moment on, every modern army would design its campaigns around supply, not the other way around. Even the Germans, once dismissive of Allied abundance, came to respect its power. After the war, former Wehrmacht officers admitted that they were defeated by American logistics as much as by American arms. In the dust of France, amidst the roar of trucks and the smell of gasoline, the Allies had uncovered a new kind of strength, one not measured in courage alone, but in endurance, coordination, and the sheer will to keep moving forward. As autumn approached, the Red Ball Express would face its greatest challenges yet. The war in Europe was entering a new phase, one where fuel shortages, weather, and enemy counterattacks would test the limits of this logistical miracle.
And soon, those endless convoys would find themselves fighting not just time, but the winter itself.
Late August 1944. The Allied front blazed across France like a wildfire. German resistance had collapsed west of the Seine, and what remained of the Wehrmacht was retreating in disarray toward the borders of Belgium and Germany. In the midst of this chaos, one force kept the Allied momentum alive. Not the tanks, not the planes, but the convoys that fed them. The Red Ball Express had reached its peak. By the end of the month, nearly 6,000 trucks and 23,000 drivers operated across a 700-mile network of roads stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines of Patton's Third Army. The system ran like an artery of motion, fuel and ammunition flowing east, wounded and empty trucks returning west. Every hour, day and night, the sound of engines thundered through the French countryside. Each truck was assigned a code. Each route had checkpoints guarded by military police. Any vehicle that broke down was pushed off the road immediately to keep the convoy moving. There was no time for hesitation. The war was moving too fast. Fuel was the lifeblood. One American armored division required nearly 350,000 liters per day just to operate. The tanks that liberated Paris drank gasoline as if it were water. Every gallon delivered meant another mile forward, another German unit trapped or destroyed. At the center of it all was Patton, relentless, impatient, obsessed with speed. His Third Army raced across the map with astonishing velocity, sometimes covering 80 miles in a single day. His columns cut through France so rapidly that Allied planners struggled to update their maps. "Keep moving," Patton told his staff, "and let the bastards worry about catching up." Behind his bravado, however, stood the unseen army of the Red Ball Express. Without them, his tanks were just metal beasts waiting to starve. Patton's advance consumed fuel faster than any army in history. So fast that even with the Red Ball running at full capacity, there were moments when he came within hours of halting for lack of gasoline. To meet demand, drivers doubled their shifts. Some went 36 hours without rest, alternating between the steering wheel and quick naps under the hood. Mechanics worked by lantern light, replacing transmissions with tools still warm from overuse. The roads themselves became battlefields. Rain turned dirt to mud, bridges collapsed under the weight of overloaded trucks. Convoys were strafed by German fighter bombers that slipped through gaps in Allied air cover. Drivers learned to zigzag under fire, never stopping, never slowing. Still, the line held. The convoys pressed on, mile after mile, carrying the pulse of Allied power deeper into Europe. One route, dubbed the main Red Ball Highway, stretched from the port of Saint-Lô to Chartres, then onward toward Verdun. Nearly 400 miles of continuous motion. At any given moment, over 900 trucks occupied that route, spaced so tightly that the headlight of one could be seen from the tailgate of the next. Military police enforced strict rules: no overtaking, no detours, no stops except for breakdowns. Each driver carried a small Red Ball insignia painted on the front bumper, a badge of belonging to the most vital lifeline of the war. Every morning, mechanics lined up beside the route with spare tires stacked like ammunition. Fuel depots dotted the countryside, marked by giant red signs. The system wasn't perfect. It was improvised, patched together from shattered roads and scavenged parts, but it worked with astonishing precision. The results were staggering. In just 82 days, the Red Ball Express delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies, enough to feed, fuel, and arm the Allied armies as they swept across France, liberated Paris, and reached the borders of Germany. Even the German generals couldn't comprehend it. They had expected the Allied advance to collapse under logistical strain. Instead, it gained momentum. The more the Allies moved, the stronger they seemed to become.
In captured interrogation reports, one Wehrmacht officer remarked bitterly, "We lost the war when we saw the endless American trucks." But beneath the triumph lay tension. Eisenhower's headquarters worried about overextension. Patton's fuel request outpaced even American industrial capacity. Every drop of gasoline had to be shipped across the Atlantic, unloaded on the beaches, and trucked hundreds of miles inland. The miracle of motion was approaching its limit. As September arrived, the Allied spearheads reached the Moselle River. The German frontier loomed ahead, the Siegfried Line, a wall of bunkers, fortresses, and defenses unlike anything the Allies had yet faced. Patton wanted to strike immediately, to breach Germany before winter. But as his tanks reached the Moselle, their engines sputtered. The gauges hit empty. The trucks of the Red Ball Express were still hundreds of miles behind, trapped on congested roads or rerouted to supply Montgomery's forces in the north. For the first time since Normandy, Patton's Third Army came to a halt, not because of the enemy, but because the miracle had reached the edge of exhaustion. The very system that had powered the Allied advance was now stretched to its breaking point. And as autumn deepened, new challenges were about to arise. The rains, the mud, the cold, and the enemy's desperate counterattacks. The Red Ball Express had carried the Allies across France, but now the true test was coming. Could logistics win a war against time, weather, and a resurgent enemy?
By mid-September 1944, the unstoppable momentum that had carried the Allies across France began to stall. The Red Ball Express, that roaring, thundering lifeline of motion, was now groaning under its own weight. The numbers were terrifying. Trucks that had once made 2 trips a day were now barely making 1. Engines were failing, tires shredded from overuse, bridges collapsed from the strain of 5-ton convoys crossing them day and night. The same drivers who had once raced forward with adrenaline now drove in silence, eyes sunken, bodies trembling from exhaustion. And then came the rain. The open roads that had baked hard under the August sun turned into rivers of mud. Trucks sunk to their axles, wheels spun uselessly. Even bulldozers struggled to pull the heavier rigs free. At night, headlights cut through sheets of rain, illuminating faces streaked with grime and fatigue. Yet, despite it all, the convoys kept moving. Because if they stopped, the war stopped. General Eisenhower faced an impossible dilemma. Patton in the south demanded fuel for his tanks to push toward the Saar. Montgomery in the north needed supplies for Operation Market Garden, his daring airborne assault into Holland. And Bradley's First Army in the center needed ammunition to hold the expanding front line. But there simply wasn't enough to go around. Each gallon of gasoline, each crate of shells, each ration of food had to be prioritized, calculated, and argued over at headquarters. Eisenhower described it as a war of fuel more than fire. The very success of the Red Ball Express had outpaced itself. In August, the front lines were only 100 miles from the ports of Normandy. By late September, they were nearly 500 miles away, and the roads behind them were clogged with wrecks, mud, and chaos. Fuel depots at the beaches still brimmed with gasoline, but it couldn't move fast enough to the front. At one point, nearly 3 million gallons sat idle in Normandy, while tanks at the front stood motionless. To make matters worse, German demolition teams had destroyed rail lines and bridges across France. Rail transport, which could have carried 10 times more cargo than the trucks, was practically useless. So the burden remained on the convoys, and the Red Ball became the only artery feeding an entire army spread across half a continent. But in war, speed always comes with a cost. As the trucks pushed eastward, German resistance stiffened. Snipers began targeting supply routes. Luftwaffe aircraft, though fewer in number, launched daring strafing runs at night. Convoys were ambushed in the forests of Lorraine.
The roads littered with burned-out wrecks of GMCs and Jeeps testified to the danger that no one back home ever saw. And still, they drove. Private Harold Yates, a driver in the Red Ball Express, later recalled, "We didn't think about heroics. You just kept your foot on the gas and hoped you didn't get hit. The trucks didn't stop for anything, not for bullets, not for bombs, not even for sleep." Despite exhaustion, breakdowns, and the endless mud, the system adapted. Mechanics cannibalized wrecked vehicles for spare parts. Fuel was stored in makeshift bladders and buried pipelines. Drivers developed coded signals using headlights to guide each other through the dark. And yet, by late October, even this ingenuity couldn't mask the growing crisis. Patton's tanks were immobilized more often than not. Ammunition was rationed, frontline divisions were ordered to hold rather than advance, not because the Germans were stronger, but because the Red Ball Express could no longer keep up. It was a cruel irony. The Allies had won the Battle of Logistic so completely that they had outrun their own victory. Then, in December 1944, came the storm that nearly broke everything: the Battle of the Bulge. In the snowy forests of the Ardennes, the German army launched a desperate counterattack, smashing through thin Allied lines. Chaos erupted, fuel dumps were seized, trucks of the Red Ball Express were suddenly ordered not to supply the front, but to evacuate and destroy what they carried to keep it from the enemy. The same roads that had once pulsed with forward momentum were now jammed with retreating vehicles, burning fuel, and desperate men trying to regroup in the cold. But out of that crisis came the moment that proved the Red Ball's worth beyond question. Within days, the same drivers who had been retreating turned around. Under constant snow, artillery fire, and freezing winds, they resumed their convoys, carrying supplies to the encircled town of Bastogne, where American paratroopers held out against overwhelming odds. The Red Ball drivers became the lifeline once again. Their trucks pushed through blizzards and enemy shelling to deliver fuel and ammunition to the trapped troops. Without those supplies, Bastogne would have fallen, and with it the entire Allied front in Western Europe. When the skies cleared and Allied air power returned, the German offensive collapsed. The Bulge was crushed, and the road to Germany reopened. By early 1945, the Red Ball had changed forms. Its routes were reorganized, renamed, and absorbed into a broader supply system stretching into Belgium and Luxembourg. But the spirit remained the same: relentless, improvised, unbreakable. By the time the convoys were finally disbanded in November 1944, they had carried over 412,000 tons of supplies, an achievement unmatched in military history. What had begun as a desperate experiment became the template for modern warfare: mobility powered by logistics, victory driven not just by courage, but by supply. For every tank that rolled, for every division that advanced, there was a driver, often nameless, behind a steering wheel, keeping the heart of the Allied army beating. When the Red Ball Express finally came to an end in November 1944, there were no parades, no grand announcements, no medals for most of its drivers. The trucks simply stopped rolling, engines cooling for the first time in months, their steel frames groaning from exhaustion. Yet, in those 3 short months, they had done something no army in history had achieved. They had kept an invasion alive across an entire continent. By the numbers alone, the scale defied comprehension. Between August and November 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered over 412,000 tons of gasoline, ammunition, rations, and spare parts. At its peak, 6,000 trucks were on the road at once, covering more than 1.5 million miles per day. It consumed a staggering 300,000 gallons of fuel daily just to deliver more fuel to the front. It was, in every sense, a war within a war, a battle of endurance fought not with rifles, but with wheels, wrenches, and willpower. And though the world saw the headlines of Patton's advance, of Paris liberated, of the Allies storming toward Germany, behind those victories was a quieter triumph of logistics, discipline, and raw determination. When historians later examined why the German army collapsed so quickly after the breakout from Normandy, they pointed not just to superior numbers or air power, but to something deeper. The Allies could move. German divisions, still reliant on horse-drawn wagons for nearly half their transport, could not retreat or resupply fast enough. Their fuel tanks ran dry, their trucks failed, ammunition dwindled. Even elite Panzer units were abandoned when gasoline ran out. By contrast, the Americans had built a machine that could feed itself in motion. The Red Ball Express made it possible for Patton's Third Army to sweep across France in record time, faster than any modern mechanized force had ever moved. This mobility shattered the German defense network. Fortifications meant to slow the Allies became useless when entire divisions simply outflanked them. Town after town fell before the enemy could regroup. In just 90 days, the German army in France, once numbering over 1 million men, was effectively destroyed. But the victory came at immense human cost for those who made it possible. The Red Ball drivers, many of them African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, endured some of the most grueling conditions of the war. They worked 12, 16, sometimes 20-hour shifts. They slept in their trucks, ate cold rations, and drove through storms, mud, and artillery fire. More than 75% of Red Ball personnel were black soldiers, serving at a time when the U.S. Army still viewed them as support, not combat troops. Yet their courage under fire and their tireless performance forced the military establishment to reconsider those prejudices. One general later admitted, "Without the Red Ball Express, we would not have been able to fight our way across France." Many of those drivers never received recognition during their lifetime. Some were buried in unmarked graves along the routes they once drove. Others returned home to a country still divided by color lines, a bitter irony for men who had helped save the world. In the field reports and diaries that survived, one can feel the exhaustion, pride, and quiet understanding of what they had done. A mechanic named Walter Richardson wrote simply, "We kept the war moving. That was our fight." By December 1944, as the convoys wound down, new rail lines had finally been repaired across France and Belgium. Trains began to take over long-distance hauling. The war's supply chain shifted from improvisation to precision. But the Red Ball Express left a legacy far beyond logistics. It became a symbol of American adaptability, of how chaos could be turned into order through willpower and organization. Every modern military supply system since then, from Korea to Vietnam, from Iraq to Afghanistan, has carried the lessons learned on those muddy French roads. Because, in the end, wars are not only won by men who pull the trigger, but by those who make sure there's still a bullet in the chamber. And on the back roads of France, through dust and rain, the men of the Red Ball Express ensured that the Allies never ran dry.
When the last trucks of the Red Ball Express rolled to a halt, Europe itself was changing. Cities once occupied by the Germans were rebuilding. Allied supply depots were shifting eastward, and the roads that had thundered under the weight of 10,000 convoys fell eerily silent. But the lessons of those 3 months, August to November 1944, did not fade. They became a doctrine, a blueprint for how modern wars would be fought and won. The Allied High Command had seen something extraordinary. Logistics, when executed with speed and scale, could act as a weapon every bit as powerful as a tank or bomber. What the Red Ball Express had proved was that mobility could be engineered. In the months following its disbandment, the American Army's Transportation Corps and Quartermaster units studied every aspect of the operation. They measured fuel efficiency, road wear, driver fatigue, and mechanical failure rates. Those studies became the foundation for post-war logistical planning, influencing not only U.S. military strategy but also NATO operations in the Cold War era. When the U.S. Army later moved across Korea in 1950, across Iraq in 1991, and through Afghanistan decades later, their supply networks, the convoys, depots, and refueling systems all trace their lineage back to the roads of France. The Red Ball Express had changed warfare from the ground up. Before it, logistics were seen as support, a background function. After it, they were recognized as the lifeblood of strategy. A general could no longer plan a campaign without first planning his supply routes. Mobility was now the true measure of power. But the impact wasn't only military. It was human, social, and symbolic. For tens of thousands of Black American soldiers, the Red Ball Express became a stage where they proved their worth beyond question. In an era when discrimination still ran deep, their work had been indispensable to victory. Although they fought not in the trenches but behind the wheel, their courage shifted perceptions within the U.S. military. Commanders who had once doubted their ability now praised their reliability and bravery under fire. General John C. H. Lee, head of the Communications Zone, wrote, "The Red Ball drivers, many of them Negro troops, have shown a devotion to duty that equals any in the field. They have driven night and day, through fire, through exhaustion, through everything." This quiet revolution would later fuel the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces in 1948 when President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, formally ending racial segregation in the military. The courage shown on those French highways had helped pave the way. In Europe, the Red Ball routes left a physical mark too. Roads widened by convoy traffic later became vital arteries for post-war commerce. French locals who had watched the endless lines of olive-drab trucks still recalled them decades later. The sound of engines echoing through the valleys, headlights streaking through the night. To them, those convoys weren't just military machines, they were a sign that liberation had come and that the world was moving forward again. For the Germans, the experience was humbling. Captured officers later admitted they had underestimated America's logistical power. Their own supply systems, stretched and rigid, had collapsed under strain. One Wehrmacht colonel, interrogated after the war, reportedly said, "We could destroy 100 tanks, but America would bring 100 more, and they would all have fuel." That was the difference. The Allies didn't just fight with courage, they fought with continuity. And so, in the cold winter of 1944 to 1945, as the Allies pushed into Germany, their trucks in depots kept humming, a seamless network feeding millions of men across hundreds of miles. The spirit of the Red Ball lived on, not as a separate route now, but as the beating heart of the Allied advance itself. When victory finally came in May 1945 and the guns fell silent, many of those same drivers looked back on their part in the war with quiet pride. They hadn't charged into battle or raised a flag over a captured city, but they had made it possible for others to do so. Their contribution was not written in headlines, but in tire tracks. Across France, Belgium, and into Germany, the invisible imprint of an army that refused to stop moving. Because in the end, that was the legacy of the Red Ball Express, a triumph of endurance, of industry, and of human willpower, proving once and for all that wars are won not only by the men who fight, but by those who make sure they can. In the grand tapestry of World War II, some victories blazed across headlines. The liberation of Paris, the fall of Berlin, the raising of flags and the thunder of artillery. But others were quieter.
hidden beneath the rumble of engines and the hum of worn-out tires. The story of the Red Ball Express belongs to that quieter kind, a triumph built not on glory, but on endurance. When historians speak of the Allied victory, they speak of courage, strategy, and sacrifice. Yet beneath it all was something more elemental: motion, the ability to move men, fuel, and food faster than an enemy could react. The Red Ball Express embodied that principle in its purest form: relentless, improvised, unstoppable. In every sense, it was the heartbeat of modern warfare, a living artery that carried the lifeblood of the Allied armies across a shattered continent. Without it, the great offensives of 1944 would have faltered. Without it, Patton's tanks would have rusted on French roadsides, and Eisenhower's armies might never have reached the Rhine. But beyond the machinery and mathematics, the Red Ball Express told a deeper human story of ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances. Men who drove through nights of terror with no headlights. Men who fixed engines by touch alone. Men who learned that victory wasn't just about the front line, it was about keeping the front line alive. They were mechanics, drivers, dispatchers, invisible soldiers in a war that depended on their grit more than the world ever realized. And when the dust finally settled, their legacy endured not just in military manuals or logistics charts, but in the very idea of what human organization could achieve under pressure. The Red Ball Express transformed how wars would be fought forever. It showed that courage could take many forms, sometimes behind the wheel of a truck, racing through darkness towards the sound of distant guns. August 25, 1944 had begun with a convoy, a line of trucks stretching to the horizon. Months later, that same line had become a symbol of movement, endurance, and unity in purpose. Because in the end, victory in Europe wasn't just carried by tanks or planes. It was carried mile by the men who refused to let the engine of freedom stop running.